I painted 3 Necron Immortals inspired by the 9th edition previews that were released a few days ago. I'm going to show you the basic approach for this standard trooper, and then we're going to look into how they adapted this scheme to more advanced troops like the Skorpech and Illuminor Szeras, and whatever archaic abomination this is, looking like it's coming straight out of the Animatrix Second Renaissance. And last but not least, I will also show you what I would do if I wanted to create my own Necron army and have it stand out and look awesome. And none of that stuff is particularly difficult to do, so watch the video until the end and your Necrons will look super dope in no time. I only used Games Workshop colors in this video so that you can follow along easily. The only thing I will substitute, and I can only highly recommend if you plan on painting a lot of metallics, is the Vallejo acrylic metal airbrush colors. You only need like 2 or 3 shades and they will make your metallics look so much better instantly. I started by airbrushing on the metallics on top of a black base coat. Of course, if you want to apply the metallics by brush, you can do that as well. The Vallejo airbrush metallics go on really smoothly also by brush, so don't worry about the name. To get the basic painting scheme of the warrior, I started to apply Raycon Flesh Shade. And keep this arm in mind, I will illustrate on it how applying a few layers of the wash can create a gradient over the metal easily, and that we can use the transparency of the washes to our advantage. I'm giving the whole model a thorough wash to create all the initial shades. This is super effective, and if I ever have to paint an army because my life depends on it, I'm going to paint Necrons because this looks great already and is really fast. The next layers I'm applying a bit more selectively, guiding the ink to where I want it to stay and where I wanted to darken the metallics even more. And by doing that, we are creating a gradient, because the higher up parts stay brighter. Next I took Vallejo's white aluminium and highlighted all the edges, and that's the metallics done. To do the weapons, I covered everything in 2 layers of Nuln oil. And then I took a grey and mixed in a bit of blue and painted the first edge highlight a little wider and brightened the color with one last smaller edge highlight on top of this. This is how the studio paint job was highlighted. Personally, I just like the look of metallic paints on edges more, so I highlighted with dark aluminium instead, simply because it's easier to get a realistic effect that way. Since metallics reflect light, you get great contrast and also a dynamic highlight pattern. Rule of cool always trumps everything else. Let's look at how to make some of these metal skeletons look even better. I took some inspiration from a few elements in the new studio paint jobs that we saw of unreleased models. First of all, these different colors they used to shade the different elements with, like this purple here, the stain marks on the Skorpech Destroyer Lord, and the differently colored carapax here. Now, I'm not saying this is exactly how they did it, but all of what I will show you mimics the results and gives you more control about how to achieve them, and achieve them even faster in some cases. And if you get asked how you did your Necron boys by Games Workshop Legends, you probably did something right. Using a bright beige base color, I'm painting the casing, the head and the rib cage. You can use Ushabti Bone or Flayed One Flesh here, but it really doesn't matter which one you take, because the end effect is created by the color we put on top of this and not the base color. I decided to add color variations to as many elements as possible, so I added washes of incubed darkness to the casing of the Gauss Blaster. Notice that the slight mist of metallics on the rifle over the initial black makes for a really nice variation effect as I do this. This is the only part where an airbrush gives us a slight advantage over just brush in this whole tutorial. Like I said, I wanted some staining patterns on all elements to underline the age of these ancient machines. And I mixed Rhinoxide and Scrag Brown, and with a blister sponge applied random stain marks all over the metal and beige parts. You could focus on the edges to mimic chipping, but here the goal was to have variation in the surfaces more than anything. I also applied the stains to the second Immortal and the Gauss Blaster to tie the elements together and show that both the figures and their gear are eons old. Notice that I focus on these large areas to add more detail and make them less boring. To apply the initial shades, I'm using Raycon Flesh Shade again, mixed with a bit of Agrax Earth Shade to darken it. I focus the shade on the recesses, but already here I start to shade the lower sides of our shapes more than the higher up parts, like the round casing of the Tesla carbine for example. The Games Workshop washes are a great tool if used selectively and with purpose. You can see how I direct the pigment to stay in certain areas and wipe it away in parts that I want brighter. The Reclaimed Flesh shade looks great over all the colors we used, the plain metallics, the beige, but also the blue shade we gave the Gauss Blaster, and any black parts that are left. Notice how everything gets drawn together by the rich brown color. I'm using the Reclaimed Flesh shade in an even more controlled way to shade certain parts even more, like that part on the handle of the Tesla carbine and the lower parts of the shoulders. That way the parts facing up stay brighter and metallic and will reflect more light. And this way we can gradually build highlights and shadows and keep the metallic appearance, without the metal looking too boring. To make the brown rust effect more pronounced, I'm adding a bit of scrag brown to the Reclaimed Flesh shade and focus on parts that would be more in the shadow to build some contrast. And using the technique of pigment pushing, I'm making sure that my gradients are smooth. Remember that I have to keep these videos short because that's how YouTube works, but I will upload the longer version of all of the individual steps to my Patreon if you want a more in-depth description of what I'm doing. I really like the result of this. Again, one could argue for it being rust or a natural color shade of the metal. Either way, it harmonizes pretty well with both the casing and the metallic parts. Inspired by the color variation in this picture, I'm adding washes of Druchii Violet to the shoulder pads, and after an initial wash that covers everything, I'm focusing on the edges and lower parts of the shoulders again to keep the gradient. I'm comparing the results so far, and looking at it, I think I need to add more of the reddish brown to my purple boy because I want them to look like they are of the same crypt world. But of course, you could have the individual models look different from each other too. It's up to you what background you want to give your army and how you want it to look. Then it was time to increase the readability of our figures and add back some highlights. Using very thin layers of white aluminium by Vallejo, I'm focusing on the edges, but I also want to bring back some of the shine we lost using washes. So using a mix of super thin glazes and stippling, I'm bringing out these metallic highlights again. And I'm highlighting more edges on the otherwise very dark Gauss Blaster, which makes it look even more menacing. At this point I also want to increase the contrast on the Tesla carbine, so I'm taking a pure bone color and intensify the edges that were also covered with the initial washes of Reclaimed Flesh shade. For my personal minis, I would probably layer and glaze up the blades for that extra smoothness, but I knew there was a relatively quick and simple way to create a similar effect. So I was base coating the blade white and started to define it in a non-metallic pattern with layers of contrast warp lightning. As you can see, adding layers over each other makes them darker, and the transparent nature of the contrast paint makes it easy to build up gradients this way. You can see that I'm juxtapositioning light and dark areas as per non-metallic metal rules, and it already makes for a nice effect. As I continued building my gradients, I lost a bit of that brightest area on the smaller edge of the blade, so I brought that back out with a glaze of white and also covered the edges to clean everything up, and then continued to add layers of contrast paint. Once I couldn't go any darker with the warp lighting, I mixed in a bit of incubi darkness and added more thin glazes, covering less and less area. I'm kinda sure the studio added black to their versions, but I like this more and it gives a really similar effect. I put down an initial layer of green with the warp lightning on the recesses of the Gauss Blaster that I wanted to glow. This establishes a bit of OSL around them, as I also cover parts of the surrounding. Then I use white and let it run into all these recesses, A white base like this makes all colors that go over it really intense, as you can see when I add another layer of warp lightning. To create the glow, I'm mixing a bit of Uriel yellow into the white and let that mix run into the still fresh contrast paint to create the gradient. To increase the glow effect, I'm adding a layer or two on the dark parts of the metal around the light source to stain it green and simulate light being radiated out from the source, and then applying a brighter green on the edges, which is where more light would reflect. I don't have any Games Workshop greens, so I was mixing in Cubic Darkness and Uriel Yellow and applied a base color to all the tubes I wanted green. I only painted one of these tubes green and decided to do the others black to draw only a minimum of attention. On the palette you can see how I mixed the green. You can of course use any green you want, but the clue here is to add more and more yellow to the mix, because we want a saturated glow effect and white would desaturate everything too much. So this is the only time I layer on color in this whole endeavor, and I pick out two spots I want to highlight. Almost like there's energy pulsing through here and into the rifle. I'm just putting a few basic highlights on the black tubes, and I tint them slightly green with contrast paint to mimic a glow effect coming from the green one. To shade the green parts, I'm using warp lightning again. And of course we also want a simple OSL effect for the eyes, which is why I base them white and add 2 layers of warp lightning over and around them. I used green lights on the first Necron to show how I would replicate the studio paint jobs, but I wanted to add my own personal touch to the other 2. Again, to set up the glow, I based all of the light elements in white. And here's where I cheated a bit and used another non-Games Workshop product. But these fluorescent Vallejo colors are really nice for working in OSL effects. So taking fluorescent orange, I'm adding layers of it to the white, making sure it pools in the recesses and leaves the upper parts of the coils lighter, almost white, to simulate that hot glowing effect. It takes a few layers, but it's worth it. Then I'm gradually mixing in a bit of Mephiston red and selectively add that to the areas I want darker, to make the brighter, glowy areas stand out more and to make the orange come out more in the overall color scheme. For the eye, I did the same thing, starting from a white sphere and also adding white to the recesses on top of the eye. A fun little detail is having a glowing spine, and you can probably have a few more glowing parts on these robot boys. You can see that adding the first layer of fluorescent orange doesn't do a lot, but as we add more layers, the white gets stained more and more, retaining the glowing white effect in the middle where we don't cover as much. I'm shading some parts like here, the lower right, a lot more to get a bit of a lens effect. And for the last layers, I'm adding some Mephiston red again. Here's the 3 of them in all their glory. I hope you learned something. If you did, remember to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any of my future uploads. If these videos help you, please consider supporting my channel through my Patreon campaign, which gives you early access to most videos and exclusive tutorials aimed at teaching all levels of Painter. I also have an affiliate link in the description for brushes and other items that every one of us has to buy anyway. And if you use these links, it gives me a bit of kickback in the process. Thanks a lot for your support, and thanks for watching. I mixed Rhinoxide and Scrag Brown and with a split and using the so I was mixing in Cubic Darkness and Uriel Yellow and